Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am blessed with the presence of yet another fascinating woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Well, first of all, Gertrude, thank you for inviting me to do this. I appreciate it. My name is Francine Gordon, and I'm based in Cupertino, California, which anybody who has an Apple product, you probably have noticed that the default for weather and things usually is Cupertino. That's because the headquarters are about 2 miles from where I live. I'm actually in the heart of Silicon Valley. And my story started many years ago when I first moved out from New York to California to be one of the first 2 women on the faculty at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. That should give you a sense of the timing when I say one of the first 2 women, because at that point, it was very unusual to have a woman faculty member at a business school, to the point that I have my one other colleague, who I'm still friends with. She told me, it didn't happen to me, but she said when she went to teach her first classes there in economics, students got up and walked out because they refused to be taught by a woman. And I had the same type of issues, although nobody just got up and walked out on me. But there was clearly a sense of not trusting that someone who was a woman could possibly teach them anything. Out of 600 students, there were 5 women. That was it. So it was a very, very different time. And it was definitely a time where, as a woman in business, it was much more challenging than it is today, although it still has its challenges. After I left Stanford, I ran a professional repertory theater where we did 8 shows in 8 months and 5 during the main season. And then we did 5 shows in 10 weeks during the summer. That became my lesson in how to run a business, because I was handling all the finances and negotiation with contracts, etc. It was a wild experience. It was a nonprofit, and we were dealing with several unions. Ultimately, financially, we weren't able to sustain it, and so the theater closed. At that point, I moved to what was then AT&T Pacific Bell, and went in as a mid-level hire, which again was unusual for them. I did several different jobs, including running a group of people who did collections for businesses, for people who didn't pay their bills. Moved over to a program where I helped plan for divestiture when they were breaking AT&T up. And for that, I was sent to New Jersey for several months in order to figure out how to do this. This is when they were going to break apart the United States phone system that was all AT&T into what they called baby bells. And that was going to be taking the equipment that was already in people's homes and separating that out from the service. When I returned, I became the head of recruiting for the company in California for Pacific Bell. And that was when I had an opportunity to look at how we went about hiring and looking at changing processes. which was an interesting experience. There were some vestigial tests that were being used that the company was reluctant to let go. For example, there was a test that was basically an intelligence test that they were using to determine if someone could come in at a first level manager level. And I really fought that, saying that's not a good indication. Not everybody tests well. It's not the most reliable tool to use. So that was one of the battles I fought. I have to admit, it was not successful, but I did my best. After working there several years, I became a director in marketing and worked on several projects to launch some new products within Pacific Bell. And then there were some major organizational changes going on that I was not in agreement with. And so I left and went to what was then the only company doing parallel computing called Tandem Computers. They were a company that was known for being very forward-thinking. They actually ran some of the stock exchanges around the world because they had parallel processing, and that enabled them to keep stock exchanges running even if there was a problem with the primary server. There I was the head of HR, and again got involved with recruiting and some other activities. They acquired a company that did networking, UB Networks, and I moved over there as the VP of HR, and had all responsibilities for human resources planning except for the compensation, which was out of my area. That was an exciting area as well. This was the first company that did both Ethernet and token ring, which was an early form of networking. And we did all kinds of things when we were there. We did lots of recruiting, we did lots of hiring, we did lots of planning on how to have stock options and things like that. Ultimately, the company had some financial issues because it became very staid in the way it was doing business. And this is a problem that companies have. When they're doing something and they're successful, they're very reluctant to change. And in this case, the way they were doing things was looking at the way you could have Ethernet and token ring set up for an entire organization. At the same time, several companies were starting to look at smaller, like division or department level systems. And the person who had founded the company I was working for was very reluctant to change. So the company had some major financial issues. It was acquired initially by HP, and it was initially acquired by Tandem Computers, and then Tandem Computers was fully acquired by HP. One of the things that, when I say this thing about it's hard to change when you're successful, to give you an example that it's not the only time this has happened. Motorola used to be the primary source of mobile phones for many, many years. And that was the one that AT&T used predominantly for its hardware. When digital came along, Motorola said, we don't want to do digital until the quality is every bit as good or better than their analog phones. And so they didn't want to switch. The result was Nokia came along, which was a small company at that point. Nokia came along and said, we'll do it. And basically they took over the market. That was a result of the company of Motorola not being willing to change. That's one of the interesting things about innovation. Success can lead to failure if a company is unwilling to change with the times. After I was at Ungerman Bass, I had originally gotten my PhD at Yale to become a consultant. However, at Yale, I was told that I should become a faculty member and do research and teaching, which is what I did because at that point in my life, I always did what I was told. Now I thought would be a good time to get back into that thought pattern of doing management consulting. And so I reached out to a variety of firms around the world and finally connected at Boston Consulting Group and became an expert in people aspects of organization change. In fact, I was fortunate to have a 6-month assignment working in Melbourne, so I'm familiar with the beautiful city, and kind of miss being there. So I was at Boston Consulting Group for several years. It was a wonderful experience. I learned about a lot of different businesses. I worked at everything from banking organizations to medical organizations to a paper mill, and how they manufacture paper and how they could change processes. It was very, very interesting work, but I spent so much time on the road that I felt like I was becoming disconnected from all my friends. So I left and decided to start my own consulting business. That was really a big step for me, something that I was very scared of, but felt I had to do that. I could not continue the commuting life. My last assignment had me commuting from California to New Jersey every week, and it was just tiring me out. My own business was initially a product called The Practical Perfectionist, where I was doing workshops helping people, mostly women, overcome their tendency to be perfectionistic, which can really get in the way of their being successful. It's a theme that I've continued working on, and now do workshops on imposter syndrome, which is very tightly connected to perfectionism. I did several projects on my own. I also did several education projects for big companies. And eventually I wound up connecting with other people doing consulting work in related fields, but not the same. And we formed Silicon Valley alliances to take on projects where they needed different types of expertise to succeed. The biggest project I had there was working with some major companies in Japan that were trying to become more international, truly global, not just having offices overseas, but having a more global perspective. That was fascinating for me as well, in that we were working with people from one company, but from around the world. We would have people come in from Europe, Asia, Latin America, all working together to figure out how to become more innovative to move the company forward. It was part of a multi-week program where different people focused on different aspects. My area was innovation and teaching them what innovation was, ways of approaching it, why it's hard, what to do, those kinds of things. I did that for several years, also did some for local companies as well, and got involved with TEDx Bay Area Women. Somebody else was the official organizer who had the license, but I did all the contacting to bring people in for speakers. So contacted all kinds of people, invited them in, did a lot of the background fundraising, etc. It was a really exciting time for me. I met some fascinating people because of the people we had coming in to speak. Learned a lot along the way. We had very large turnout. We did them at various companies like Microsoft and Google, which would host them. Did that for several years. And eventually we were told we couldn't do TEDx Bay Area Women. It had to be TEDx Bay Area. That was dictated by the group that controls TEDx. And so we did one or two programs that was broader where we had more men speakers, although men were always invited to all our sessions. And we did a few more years, and then the organizer decided to give up the license, and I decided I did not want to pursue it further. At the same time, I started an organization called SV Forum, Silicon Valley Forum, Tech Women, where women from all aspects of technology, be it whether they were working in the computer science part or the finance or whatever, these were women working in companies that were technology, of which we have many, many, as you can imagine, in Silicon Valley. Every month we'd have a program. Some would be on professional development, like how to do self-promotion. Some would be like we did one on looking at genetic research that was focused on women. There were lots of medical projects that were now looking at women differently than had been done before. In the past, most medical research focused on men and kind of treated women as just like men, except we have somewhat different biology, hormones, etc. And now this was changing. So we had some women who were involved in some of those kinds of research, product development areas. We also had panels of women VCs talking about how they came about, how they started their companies, the challenges they faced. We had panels with women entrepreneurs who talked about how they came up with the idea for their particular business, the challenges they faced in raising money, which was interesting. One company called SlideShare, the primary driver was the woman, Rashmi, and her husband would usually be with her, and they would always ask her husband questions. So he finally stopped going because the VCs always turned to him. And she said, no, I'm the primary driver. He's working for me. I'm the one who started it. We had lots of stories like that. We also spoke to VCs, both men and women, to talk about what they looked for when they were trying to decide to fund somebody, and to talk about, for the women VCs, what some of the challenges they had compared to the male that they work with. I did that for about 10 years and continued to do it until one day, somebody I had met through TEDx Bay Area was on the faculty at Santa Clara University, Levy School of Business. She called me and she said, somebody just went out on medical leave. I know you used to teach this. Can you possibly pick up the class? It starts next week. I had not been in a regular classroom. I had taught workshops. I had done Stanford extensions, continuing studies classes where I didn't have to do grading. This was going to be a regular class where I'd have meetings every week and I'd have to do the grading. And oh, by the way, it was undergrad and I had never taught undergrads. But the subject matter was something I was familiar with. So I went to teach the one class. Bottom line, I've never left. So I've been at Santa Clara University since September 2014. And now I teach both graduate and undergraduate classes.
Wow. What an amazing journey, Francine, you've been on. This is so inspiring. You know, you have broken so many barriers. You've been in the forefront of forging the way for women, really, in technology and finance and business. You know, when I found you on LinkedIn, I couldn't believe my luck. I would meet this one person who just encapsulates so much. So, how do you define diversity, and why is it critical for businesses today, do you think?
So, most people, when they think about diversity, think predominantly about race, color, possibly gender, sexual orientation, maybe disability. But actually, diversity is much broader than that. It's also different socioeconomic background, different education. Literally, people who go to one school may have a very different expectation of how the world works than somebody else. And I mean, even universities. And
Yes.
so it's looking at all those differences and looking at how you can get people to work together. It's really important because as the world is now, it's really global and it's made up of all different kinds of people. It's really important to know what's going to work for different people and get different perspectives. You get much more challenging and interesting ideas when you have people come in who don't all think alike. It makes it a little bit harder. For example, if you have people from engineering talking to people in marketing, they usually have different language and they don't always like each other, quite frankly, even though they work for the same company. But if you can get them to work together, they can have very unique insights that each group alone would never have, because they bring different perspectives and they look at the same thing different ways. So it's really important nowadays for companies to be able to look at it. Examples of when it didn't happen was many, many years ago, GM had a car called the Chevy Nova, which for some reason didn't sell in Latin America. Well, the reason is in Spanish, Nova means no go. Not a great name for a car. I mean, it's why didn't somebody ask? Or at one point, I think it was Procter & Gamble wanted to move into the market in India. And that they felt the cheapest way for people to buy things was to buy in bulk. I don't know if you have stores like Costco in Australia. I know they have several in Europe.
Yes.
Where you buy in bulk, right? Because it's cheaper per ounce or per item. Yes. So they thought, okay, we know that there are financial issues in India, so we'll sell these big boxes of whatever, food or, dry foods, appliances. The problem is it didn't sell. Well, the reason was, although the cost per ounce or unit was cheaper, people couldn't afford to buy 40 at the same time.
Yes.
And they didn't have the place to store it. And they, quite frankly, I mean, they didn't really need, I mean, these big bottles and things, some of them wound up being used for tables and things because they just, I mean,
Oh,
it was a totally different economy. Nobody
yeah.
had really sat down and said, well, what's going to work? So eventually they changed. Now they sell, you know, you can get laundry detergent in packets for 1 or 2 washes, etc. But it was like, oh, we know this is going to work. We're going to make it so cheap. We'll do all this bulk stuff. And it was like, no, it
Uh,
didn't really work. And nobody had asked.
so consultation is critical. So from your experience, what are some of the common challenges that businesses who are trying to implement diversity and inclusion initiatives face, and how can they overcome those challenges?
One of the issues is change is hard. People are very, very resistant to change. In my classes, I often will have students do this thing where you say, cross your arms like this, and then cross them the other way. And it feels very uncomfortable. I mean, it's a minor change, but people don't like it. It feels wrong. When you talk about becoming more diverse, you're asking people to look at different ways of hiring people, evaluating people, different sources. And different people will come in with different languages, with different ideas. And you may say, well, I don't like that idea. It's different. Well, maybe what you need to do is find out more, find out, you know, how that person came up with that conclusion. Or a friend of mine has taught me that the best phrase in the world is, help me understand. 2 people have different perspectives. Help me understand why you think this is the way to do it. And I'll tell you how I believe it happens. And we can see if we can make it work. So if there's a difference in languages in terms of also just the acronyms that you use, et cetera. And so it makes it more challenging. When you have more diverse groups, they tend to have a little bit more, they do have more difficulty working because they have different perspectives. And it also leads to much more healthy, if done, healthy conflict, which will lead to much better outcomes. The other thing is trying to figure out how to balance it. We talk about the importance of diversity, but more important, inclusion and equity, because some companies are very good at saying, oh, look, we have our numbers. We set these objectives and we have this many people who are Black or Hispanic or, you know, who are disabled, and we've met our numbers, but nothing is done within the company to accommodate. So having diversity without inclusion, quite frankly, is useless. I mean, you wind up with people feeling very isolated, and those people tend to leave. It's been said that if you want to have real diversity, for example, with women early on, they used to say, if you want to have women be successful, you should have at least 2 or 3 women in the same part of the organization who can be, you know, use each other for support, but also not be the token woman. I mean, I remember, I was the first woman in my department at Yale. I was one of the first 2 women at the department at Stanford. And people kind of ask you, well, what do women think about it? Well, what do you mean, what do women think about it? Everybody thinks differently. I can't tell you. And you see a lot of that happen with people of color and people of different races. You know, well, tell me what the Black people think about it. I'm one Black person. I can't tell you what everybody says. And so it becomes sort of like, it puts you in an awkward position. And so you don't want to do that. And you don't want to feel like if you don't succeed, the world's going to fall apart, because there's something called stereotype threat. And quite frankly, when you're the only one, anything you do is viewed as everybody who, all women, all Black, blah, blah, blah. They don't succeed. This means no one is going to succeed. And so you feel a much bigger burden. It makes it much harder to succeed.
Oh, wow. So how do you bring your real world experience into the classroom at Santa Clara University?
One of the reasons it's so much better being in Santa Clara is A, I have a lot of business experience, and B, I'm older than my students. When I taught at Stanford, the students were about 30 and I was 23. So it was a little difficult to get their respect. I often use examples of things that I've observed in terms of making a point. If I'm talking, and I also teach classes on how to manage people in general and human resources management. And so I'll use examples of what I've seen, how somebody has been treated, or how somebody who was a really great manager was able to get outstanding performance out of employees because they were so motivated. Can talk about companies that didn't do well because and like I mentioned, like Motorola didn't do well because it didn't change. And so if I'm talking about innovation, I'll talk about, here's an example. By the way, when companies, well, when the way was from basically from having mobile phones to having, PDAs like iPhones and Androids, Nokia didn't want to make the change, which is why Nokia had eventually had to be acquired by Microsoft, because they didn't change either. They had really, really great mobile phones, but they didn't make the change to have multi-purpose PDAs, basically. So I'll use stories like that, or I'll talk about situations where I'll talk about my situation about being the only woman in a department. And when I first started at Stanford, quite frankly, the women right across the hall from me were secretaries, and they refused to work for a woman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you got the discrimination from women as well. So you were getting it from both sides. How
Absolutely.
challenging.
Well, it was because it was different. And again, people don't like change. I'm used to working for men. I don't work for women.
Yes, yes. So what are some of the key insights or lessons you aim to impart on your students regarding diversity and inclusion?
The way I teach it, I focus a lot on personal conversations, because the biggest barrier to really having inclusion is unconscious bias. We all have unconscious biases. And the fact that they're unconscious, by definition, means we're not aware of them. But they're the result of how we were raised. Here in the US, I mean, until quite recently, anytime you watched a television show, the main characters were white. More recently, there have been some cases where, yes, you have shows where they're primary Black players. But for a long time, you'd see the Black people as being either the servants or the nanny or some other position. And if you're growing up in that, you learn that white people have certain kinds of jobs and Black people don't. And I have people do a self-assessment using the Harvard IAT implicit attitude tests, which basically I have them rate, among other things, look at race and look at gender and look at some other things. It's not unusual for Black people raised in the United States to have a preference for people who are light-skinned. And they're always surprised. It's like, I can't believe, because it's a complicated way they do the test, but they kind of go, I can't believe it. And I kind of say, look at where you were raised. Look at who your role models were. Look at look at the movies, look at television. You don't realize it. And so to some extent, you sort of self-sabotage because you think less of yourself based on everything you've been exposed to. And it also happens with other people. The other reason I do that is I want people to be aware of the fact that if somebody says something that sounds as if somebody's racist or colorist or whatever, don't assume that they mean ill. They may not realize it. And so one thing you may want to do is assume that they have a good intent and explain why this might be upsetting. There's a former football player named Emmanuel Acho. I never follow football.
Yes.
I have been
following him.
He's got a wonderful series. And he talks about, he grew up in a wealthy neighborhood in Dallas, went to a private school. And he said, when I was young, my friend said, you don't sound Black, you don't dress Black. And he said, I took it as a compliment. Now he says, I realize what it implies is that Blacks don't dress well, don't speak well. He said, now I realize it was meant as a compliment, but it had a negative connotation. That would be considered a microaggression. And it wasn't that his friends were trying to be mean or anything. They were truly complimenting him. So becoming aware of that.
I get that a lot when people say you speak English really well. It's like, why shouldn't I?
I'm in an English speaking country.
Yes.
Yeah. It's really
fascinating.
People, if somebody looks Asian, they'll be surprised. Oh, you speak English, or where did you come from? I have, in my last class, I had that woman I had a Chinese woman, a Japanese woman. And she said, people say, where are you from? And she said, I grew up in San Jose. No, where are you really from? She said, I was born in the United States. It's like, it's just crazy. And so becoming aware of it on the one hand, when you do it, but also becoming aware that somebody may say something with good intent, not realizing that
negatively.
Yeah. And so becoming aware of it is the first step. It doesn't automatically go away. You need to be conscious of it, and you need to be open to feedback. To hear somebody say, that that really hurt me when you said XYZ. I know you didn't mean it, but whatever.
This is how it landed. Yeah. So, how are universities, particularly business schools, evolving in their approach to teaching diversity and inclusion?
Slowly, unfortunately. There's not enough emphasis in it, in my opinion. Particularly in the business school, I have one of the only classes that talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, I didn't focus on the normal thing is to focus on the business aspects, why it's good for business and the financials. And I talk a little bit about it, but I really focus on the way to overcome unconscious bias is to talk to people who are different than yourself. Just having the contact changes the way you feel about people, because you may feel like, well, I can't trust, well, one of the women in my class is she's from Iran. And she said where she grew up, Black people were always seen as being vicious. Well, of course, a lot of it had to do with American movies where the bad guys were Black. She said when she moved here, her family was so afraid of anybody who was Black that at one point, one of her cousins was dating a surgeon who was Black. And the family was concerned that they'd be safe with him. And you kind of go, this is crazy. But again, they were raised in an environment where they had not been exposed to Black people and didn't know that was all a stereotype that has been perpetuated in the media.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I lived in South Africa, we lived in an all-white neighborhood. None of our neighbors ever talked to us for 7 years until our next door neighbor had a heart attack one day. My ex-husband was a doctor. The wife knew he worked at the hospital. She came and knocked at the door at 2 a.m. We went over, we helped her, resuscitated him, called an ambulance. The next day, she told everybody in the street how wonderful we were. But we had been in that neighborhood for 7 years.
It's a sad commentary that it had to come to that kind of an emergency to get them to understand that you have a lot to offer, that you're just like them.
Oh, man. So as the founding member of Silicon Valley Alliances, what was the primary goal of this group when it was established?
To be able to take on larger projects and to be able to have somebody to work with, because most of us were solopreneurs. And sometimes you like to have somebody else to work with. So it allowed us to find projects where several of us could work together, which becomes a lot more enjoyable, quite frankly. And we do much better work because we can take on projects that are more complex. Each of us has our own area of expertise. Some are much better at, technical aspects. Some are much better at finance aspects. We have all of those skills available, but not in one person.
How do alliances like Silicon Valley Alliance play a role in fostering a more diverse tech ecosystem?
It focuses mostly on skills diversity, although we have in terms of race, et cetera, we're diverse. But it originally started because we wanted to recognize that there are diverse skills, diverse perspectives. Some people come from other countries. They bring their own perspectives. You have you have much more opportunity to come up with innovative ideas and make unique proposals because you're not siloed into your own way of looking at the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, I've met a lot of wonderful people because different people refer other people in. And so I have this really great network of wonderful, talented consultants.
Fantastic. So based on your observations, what are some of the outcomes, challenges, and opportunities for diversity and inclusion in the tech and business sectors?
Challenges, again, a lot of it has to do with unconscious bias and just the sense of, I'm talking about the US in particular. We really have a system that has been inequitable for people who are predominantly people of color. By that, I mean, very often they don't have the same educational opportunities. They don't have the same, literally, healthcare. They don't have the same access to food, et cetera. And so you look at somebody in that environment and they're suffering some deficits, not because they're incompetent, but because they haven't had the resources to develop themselves more fully. One of I should have pulled it up. One of the visuals I use, if you look at three kids trying to look at a baseball game where there's a fence, if you give all of them a box and one kid is really short and one's really tall, the tall one will be able to see the game, the short one won't. If you want, that's equality. If you want equity, you need to take into account that the short child needs a much higher box because he doesn't have the height that the taller one does. And so you need to make some accommodation to provide an equitable solution. That's a hard thing for some people to understand. I mean, sometimes it's like, well, they just don't know how to do this or that. And it's kind of like, look at where they came from. Give them a break, you know. That doesn't mean they don't have to work, and it doesn't mean they have substandard, you know, have to accept substandards. But you have to be willing to make some accommodation, and don't bring them in and then say, well, you don't look like us. And for many years, people who were Black would be brought into the organization. They would straighten their hair because it wasn't acceptable, and they would have to change the way they dressed. It's like they would have to really assimilate in order to be acceptable. It's like, it's awful.
Yeah. So if you were to reflect back over the years, how have your personal views on diversity and inclusion evolved? And who or what have been your biggest influence or inspiration?
So I'm going to be painfully honest. There was a time when I thought homosexuality was not appropriate. I mean, my parents, quite frankly, had talked about, you know, quote unquote fairies, you know, people who were gay were fairies. And so I had that in my head initially. But over time, I was exposed to people who were gay. I ran a professional repertory theater. I don't know if I even mentioned that, but I ran a professional repertory theater for several years. And many of the people who worked there were homosexuals, a lot of the people. And they were very comfortable talking about it. And I got comfortable with it. In fact, when I started working at the theater, I actually was still doing some teaching. And I remember I was teaching a class on sex and gender issues in the workplace. And I had a particular activity that would talk about masculine versus feminine characteristics. And my class happened to be all male, which at the school was not unusual. And I did this activity, and the difference between male and female was non-existent. And I must have had a funny look on my face. I'm not a good poker player. What can I say? And some of them said, Professor Gordon, would it help if we told you most of us are gay? And I said, thank you. Yes, that helps. I mean, the fact that they were willing to talk about it with me, and they knew that I was comfortable with it because they knew I was involved with the theater part-time. And right. So that changed me. I mean, it was like, oh yeah, it's fine. And so that's something that really evolved. I'll also say there was a time where I couldn't say that somebody was Black. It was like, you can't describe somebody like that. For some reason, it felt wrong. And again, just over time, you realize it's a descriptor, just like, you know, short hair, long hair, blonde, dark hair, white skin, black skin. You know, it's like, it's just a descriptor. It took me a while to get there. Mm-hmm. And I know other people have felt that. There was a woman, Doris Hazard Cordell, a wonderful, very well-established lawyer who's now retired, and she's a Black woman. And she said, I remember her saying, you know, I'll be in a room with a lot of other judges and someone comes looking for me and nobody has told her I'm the only Black woman in the room. So they're trying to figure out who it is. She said, I'm the only Black woman in the room. Just say she's the only Black judge in the room. Then you'll know who I am. But I mean, so I know I'm not the only one who's had that, but those are the kinds of things that over time I've evolved and realized I have these hangups from my own exposure. I mean, I've been socialized like everybody else. And so just by dealing with different people, it's really changed my view of the world.
I love that. So now let me take you back for my last question. If I could take you back to that young woman who started out in the world of business, all alone in the world, if somebody could have given you 3 nuggets of wisdom, so just in case there's a young woman who's listening to this podcast and is looking to break into tech and the business world today, what 3 nuggets of wisdom would you give her?
It's a great question. Trust your instincts. I mean, I think I was like I said, I never meant to be a faculty member at Stanford. The word is co-opted. I was told that's what I should do. I should have just stuck to my guns and said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do consulting, but I didn't. So part of it is Don't let people tell you what you should do. Stick to what you think is right. Second thing is be kind to yourself. I think a lot of women in particular, and there are also men who are affected by this, have this combination of perfectionism and imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome doesn't mean you're faking it. Imposter syndrome feels like, well, I'm not good enough, and someone's going to find out that I'm really not as smart as they think I am. You are as smart as you think you are. There are people who think they know everything, who know nothing. Those are the people who are incompetent, but they think they're competent. People who are very competent are much more likely to feel like imposters because they know how much they would want to know. And so I think it's important that, young women in particular say, I am good enough, and I'm not going to let other people tell me what to do. And I'll take in what people say when they say I do good things and not write it off as, oh, you're just being nice to me, which is something I tend to do. That's two.
What's the third one?
It may not apply to everyone, but one is, and it's funny, this is something that other people have said as well. Sheryl Sandberg has made the comment, if you're going to be in a relationship, it's got to be someone who's going to support you. And I don't mean financially support you. It's got to be someone who's willing to accept the fact that you have your own life to live and you have certain obligations that come with it, and not assume that you're going to do everything in the house. I mean, very often women who have professions are doing all the housework, and maybe the men are taking out the garbage or something like that. And it's like, well, isn't that wonderful? The couples that are really successful they're really partners. They're not just spouses. They're true partners where they're taking care of the household and the children jointly, and they support each other. It's not like, well, you have to do it. You have to take care of the house regardless of what you do. And so I think who you choose to be with is a big important factor.
That's a very good one. Wow. Dr. Gordon, I don't have the words to thank you for this amazing interview. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for paving the way for women worldwide and sharing your story with us today. This is very, very inspiring.
Thank you for the opportunity. I hope it helps.
It sure does. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. The Diversity Connector is bringing you people from all over the world, sharing different perspectives around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So tune in again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And bye for now. Thank you, Dr. Gordon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And that's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open, and definitely